Amara had always been the light of her mother's life. A bright and spirited 16-year-old. Her beauty shone through even in the harshest of conditions. Living with her mother, Nia, in the remote town of Ikorodu, they had managed to survive on the little they had. Their lives were simple, centered around Nia's fruit stall at the corner of their street. She sold fresh fruits, bananas, oranges and mangoes, trying to make ends meet, but her earnings were barely enough to keep the roof over their heads. Nia had been a widow for 5 years, ever since Amara's father, Olu, was killed in a tragic accident. He worked as a factory laborer, and one fateful evening, a reckless driver ended his life as he was walking home. That day, the weight of the world came crashing down on Nia. At 39, after years of trying to have a child, she finally bore Amara. But life had dealt her a cruel hand. She lost her husband and with it most of her joy. Yet she pressed on, never complaining, working hard to provide for Amara. Amara never really understood the depth of her mother's sacrifice. She had always known that their circumstances were far from ideal, but she never complained. When her mother could no longer hawk fruits due to a debilitating knee problem, it was Amara who took up the responsibility. Every day after school, she balanced a tray of fruits on her head and made her way through the crowded streets, hoping to sell enough to cover their expenses. She often faced disapproving glances from neighbors who would caution Nia about letting her daughter work so much, especially as she grew into a beautiful young woman. But Nia, despite her worries, had no other choice. "If she doesn't hawk, we will starve," Nia would say, and Amara would simply nod, understanding the harsh truth of their existence. One day, as Amara walked through the busy streets, her tray filled with ripe oranges, she caught the eye of a man standing by the roadside. His gaze was intense, unsettling in a way, but Amara didn't think much of it. After all, she had seen all sorts of people in her years of selling fruit. He approached her, asking for 2 oranges. He smiled at her, but there was something about it that made her uncomfortable. She had learned long ago not to trust strangers, especially those with intentions she couldn't read. "How much for the oranges?" the man asked. 2 for 50 naira, Amara replied, her voice steady despite the unease creeping up her spine. He smiled again and gestured for her to follow him. "My house is just nearby. I'll buy plenty from you." "Come," he said. Amara hesitated. She had been warned by her mother and neighbors never to follow strange men, but she was desperate. They needed the money, and she could not afford to turn down any opportunity. Reluctantly, she agreed, following him through the winding streets. As they walked, the quietness of the neighborhood made Amara's nerves tingle. This was a part of town she wasn't familiar with, and her instincts screamed at her to turn back. But the promise of a big sale made her push forward. By the time they reached the compound, she felt her heart begin to race. The man's behavior had shifted, the smile from earlier replaced with something darker, more predatory. "What do you want me to pack for you?" Amara asked, her voice shaky, still holding the tray on her head. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer, his intentions becoming frighteningly clear. Amara's breath caught in her throat. She dropped the tray and tried to make a run for the gate, but the man grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the building. She quickly realized they were in an unfinished building, the walls crumbling, empty and cold. Panic surged through her chest, and she screamed, but the walls swallowed her voice. No one came. No one heard. That evening, Amara's world shattered. The innocence she had clung to in the face of their poverty was stripped away, and the cruelty of the world hit her with an unforgiving force. The man did what he pleased, and when he was done, he threw her aside like a piece of trash. Amara ran, her feet pounding against the hard ground, leaving behind the tray, her shoes, and everything that had once been part of her life. She ran until she could run no more, tears streaming down her face. When she finally made it home, her mother was already asleep. Amara did not dare wake her. She couldn't bear to face her mother's questions, or her own shame. She went to bed without food that night, her heart heavy with sorrow. The memory of the man's face haunted her, and no matter how tightly she squeezed her eyes shut, She couldn't escape the images of what had happened. The next day, Amara did not mention the incident to her mother. She continued with the routine, trying to bury the pain deep within her. When her mother inquired about her missing tray, Amara feigned ignorance, and they both searched for it. After a few weeks they gave up. But the truth was, Amara could no longer pretend. Something inside her was changing. Her body began to feel different. Her stomach became harder, and the changes were becoming too obvious to ignore. She tried to hide it, wearing loose clothes, hoping that her mother wouldn't notice. But it didn't take long for Nia to sense that something was wrong. One evening, as they sat together in their small room, Nia turned to her daughter with a quiet, worried expression. "Amara, what's going on with you? You've been acting strange," she said softly. Amara looked down, her heart pounding. She wanted to tell her mother everything but couldn't find the words. Instead, she muttered, "I'm fine, Mama." Nia's suspicion grew, and the next week, when Amara returned from school, she could no longer hide the truth. "Come here, my daughter," Nia said firmly, guiding her to sit. Without a word, Nia placed a hand on her daughter's stomach. The silence between them was deafening. "You're pregnant," Nia whispered, her voice trembling. Amara collapsed to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Mama," she cried. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know what to do. He forced himself on me." Nia's heart shattered. She had always tried to protect Amara, but now she felt as if she had failed. She reached out, gently cradling her daughter's face in her hands. "You are just a child, Amara. You didn't deserve this. The world has been cruel to you." They cried together, and for the first time in months, Amara allowed herself to mourn. Not just for the child she carried but for everything she had lost. Days passed, and Nia's health deteriorated. Her once strong body weakened rapidly. Amara had to care for her mother, cooking, cleaning and running errands, but the strain was too much for both of them. They had no money, no food, and no one to turn to. Then, one evening, when Amara was about 4 months pregnant, Nia's condition worsened. Her breathing became labored, and Amara could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her. She sat by her mother's side, holding her hand tightly. "Promise me, Amara," Nia whispered faintly. "Promise me you will survive. No matter what happens, you must stay strong. You have a life inside you now, and you must fight." "I promise, Mama," Amara choked out, tears falling freely. Nia's grip on her hand weakened, and with one final shuddering breath, Nia slipped away, leaving Amara utterly alone. The world around her seemed to fall silent. The woman who had loved her, cared for her, and fought to keep her safe was gone. The only family she had ever known was no more. Amara wept for hours, her grief raw and unrestrained. Her life, already a struggle, had just become even harder.